The air in the Praxis Omega research station tasted of ozone and sterile fear, a metallic tang that clung to the back of the throat. Deep within the cold heart of Segmentum Pacificus, where the stars were sparse and the void stretched with unsettling depth, the station was a lonely sentinel. Its purpose, to observe and perhaps to tame a nascent warp anomaly that bled raw psychic energy into real space, a scar on the skin of reality. For 3 Terran cycles, the Vorlagian 7th Armored Infantry, the Stonehearts of Vorlag, had stood guard. They were a regiment born of rock and iron, hailing from the asteroid-mined world of Vorlag Prime. Their home world, a unforgiving rock rich in promethium and heavy metals, had forged its children into unyielding, stubborn bastions of the Imperium. They wore their heavy carapace armor not as protection, but as a second skin, each plate a testament to the planet's resilience and the Emperor's unyielding will. Their flak cloaks, woven with ferrofibers, were often stained with the rust-red dust of their home, a perpetual reminder of their origins. Unlike the more flamboyant regiments, the Vorlagians were dour, pragmatic, and utterly indomitable. They did not break. They ground their enemies into dust. Colonel Kalen Thorne, a man whose face was a roadmap of forgotten battles, and whose eyes held the weary wisdom of 100 campaigns, stood on the command bridge. The flickering holographic displays before him painted a bleak picture. The warp anomaly, initially a shimmering ethereal veil, had intensified. It pulsed with a malevolent, hungry light, pushing against the Praxis Omega's gellar fields with increasing force. Tech priests, frantic and pale, scurried across their consecrated data slates, chanting binary prayers to the machine god, their augurs screaming. "Status report, Magos." Thorne's voice was a gravelly rumble, cutting through the rising din. His hand, calloused from years of gripping a chainsword, rested on the hilt of the relic blade gifted to his family line generations ago, a symbol of his unwavering duty. Magos Explorator Alpha 7. Kalen, a skeletal figure swathed in crimson robes, his faceplate a gleaming, segmented insectoid mask, turned slowly. His optical sensors whirred with an audible grind. "The temporal flux has reached critical levels, Colonel. The anomaly is expanding. Containment fields are failing. We have overtaxed the Praxis Omega's temporal displacement generators in our attempt to stabilize the anomaly. The consequences are unpredictable." His modulated voice crackled with static, a telltale sign of his growing agitation. Thorne didn't need the tech priest's technical jargon to understand. The deck plates beneath his armored boots vibrated with a sickening resonance. Lights flickered, plunging the bridge into momentary darkness before sputtering back to life. He could feel the pressure of the warp. A cold, hungry presence pressing in from all sides, seeking purchase, seeking minds to twist and souls to devour. Demon kind. He had faced them before, on forgotten battlefields, their forms an affront to sanity. All personnel to emergency stations. Defensive posture, Delta 3. Prepare for incursion. Thorn roared, his voice amplified by his helmet's voxcaster, cutting through the growing panic. Guardsmen, clad in their distinctive heavy carapace, moved with practiced efficiency. Lass rifles were brought to bear, their power packs glowing faintly. Their heavy stubbers, bolt guns, and melta-guns, archaic by some standards, but robust and lovingly maintained, were readied. The Praxis Omega was primarily a research vessel, not a fortress. Its defensive emplacements were minimal, designed to deter minor Xenos incursions, not a full-blown assault from the raw stuff of the warp. Yet the Vorlagian 7th had fortified it as best they could, their dug-in positions reinforcing key choke points, barricades of repurposed cargo containers, and ferrocrete slabs standing defiantly against the inevitable. Suddenly, a blinding flash erupted from the central observation chamber, where the anomaly pulsed like a dying star. A wave of raw, unfiltered psychic energy washed over the station. Guardsmen screamed as their minds were assaulted by visions of impossible geometries and chittering horrors. Thorn felt his own will buckle for a split second. The collective terror of billions of souls crying out in the void. A cacophony of suffering threatening to overwhelm him. He gritted his teeth, gripping his chainsword tighter, focusing on the Emperor's light, a single, unwavering point of sanity in the encroaching madness. Maintain formation, for the Emperor, for Vorlag. Sergeant Kael Kael, a towering Vorlagian with a scar bisecting his left eye, bellowed, his voice hoarse but resolute. His squad, veterans of 100 minor skirmishes, held their ground, their faces grim masks of determination. Then the true horror began. The Geller fields collapsed with a shriek of tortured metal and tearing reality. The bulkheads buckled inwards, not under physical force, but under an unseen temporal strain. Reality twisted. The air shimmered, the colors of the bridge washing out, then intensifying to blinding, kaleidoscopic hues. The lights pulsed erratically, casting long, distorted shadows that writhed like living things. Outside the viewports, the stars elongated, stretching into impossible streaks of light, then blurring into an indistinct smear. the warp anomaly itself, once contained, now consumed the entire field of view, a maelstrom of iridescent colors and screaming phantoms. The Praxis Omega was no longer just observing the anomaly. It was being consumed by it. A high-pitched whine, like the keening of 1,000 tortured souls, filled the station. It wasn't just noise. It was a physical force, shaking the very bones of the station, rattling the teeth in the guardsmen's skulls. Thorn felt a profound disorientation, a sickening lurch, as if his very being was being pulled apart and reassembled. Time seemed to stretch, then snap, then stretch again. A rubber band snapping under immense pressure. He saw his men, their faces contorted in silent screams behind their helms, their bodies frozen in mid-motion. A bolt gun round, fired an instant before, hung suspended in the air, its trajectory halted mid-flight, an impossible metallic teardrop. A tech priest, mid-chant, was a statue of terror, his mechanical arm reaching out, frozen in an act of desperate supplication. The air grew heavy, thick with an almost tangible pressure that pinned them all in place. It was as if every atom in the Praxis Omega, every guardsman, every bolt of their ancient weaponry, had been coated in a viscous, unyielding tar. They were not dead, not unconscious, but suspended, trapped, observing their own petrification, their own silent, agonizing immobility. Colonel Thorn struggled against the unseen bonds, his muscles screaming in protest, but he could not move, could not speak. Only his mind raced, a caged beast of thought. He saw the anomaly surge again, a final, overwhelming burst of chronal energy. It wasn't a destructive wave, not a fiery explosion, but a complete envelopment, a drowning. The station, the Vorlagian Seventh, the very fragment of reality they occupied, was pulled taut, stretched thin, across an unimaginable temporal expanse. The last thing Thorn consciously registered was the image of the Emperor on his chainsword's hilt, a stern, unyielding gaze, before even that faded into a hazy, dream-like state. A profound, endless stillness descended upon the Praxis Omega, a quiet tomb where time itself had ceased to flow, leaving the stone hearts of Vorlog suspended in an eternity of grim, silent vigil. They were caught not in the warp, but in a strange, impossible pocket of real space, frozen outside of history, awaiting an awakening that might never come. The silent, eternal vigil of the stone hearts was shattered not by a gradual return to reality, but by a sudden, violent wrenching. The oppressive, viscous pressure that had held them captive for untold millennia reversed with an audible snap, like a stressed cable finally breaking. Time, once a stagnant pool, became a raging torrent, slamming into their consciousness with the force of a physical blow. Colonel Thorne gasped. A ragged, desperate sound as air flooded his lungs for the first time in what felt like an eternity. His ears rang with a deafening cacophony, the shriek of tortured metal, the groan of buckling bulkheads, the sudden, frantic chattering of overloaded augers, and the primal shouts of his men. The kaleidoscope of colors that had been branded onto his retinas exploded into sharp, harsh reality. The bridge, once frozen in its moment of crisis, now shrieked and groaned with every strain, its lights flickering madly before settling into a dull, amber glow, powered by the Praxis, Omega's stubbornly persistent emergency generators. Disorientation was a physical agony. His muscles, long locked in stasis, screamed as he tried to move. His head pounded, his vision swam, and for a terrifying instant, he thought he was suffering a warp-induced seizure. But the disciplined training of the Vorlagian Seventh, ingrained through generations of brutal, unyielding service, asserted itself even in the depths of confusion. He fought through the haze, forcing his mind to reassert control over his protesting body. "Status! Report! Now!" Thorne barked, his voice raw, struggling against the metallic taste of dust and the lingering phantom echoes of timeless horror in his throat. Slowly, painfully, his men responded. Sergeant Kyle, leaning heavily against a console, coughed, then straightened his imposing frame. "Sir, we're alive. Most of us. Systems are chaotic." His voice was rough, barely more than a whisper, but the unwavering steel in his eyes was unmistakable. Other guardsmen, slumped against walls or scrambling to their feet, mirrored his dazed but determined expression. Many were clutching their heads, groaning, but none had broken. A testament to Vorlagian fortitude. Magos Explorator Alpha 7. Kalen, miraculously, was also stirring. His metallic limbs twitched, circuits sparking faintly, his data slates lying shattered around him. He uttered a string of binary curses, then slowly, agonizingly, began to re-engage his internal diagnostics. His optical sensors whirred, focusing on the chaos around them. Temporal stabilization achieved. The anomaly, it has collapsed, but not before displacement. "Displacement where, Magos?" Thorne demanded, finally managing to brace himself against the command console. He looked around. The bridge was a wreck. Console screens were cracked, wires hung like severed arteries, and the floor was littered with debris, dust, and the occasional skeletal remains of a less fortunate tech acolyte or station worker who had not been within the protective embrace of the time dilation bubble. Dust. Thick, ancient dust lay everywhere, coating every surface in a fine gray film, as if the station had been abandoned for centuries. This was not the same Praxis Omega. Not exactly. The damage was consistent with the initial collapse of the Geller fields, but the pervasive dust, the corrosion on metal that should have been pristine inside a sealed station, the faint, acrid smell of ozone mixed with something else, something ancient and decaying. It was wrong. Thorn forced his attention to the main viewports. What he saw sent a chill, far colder than the vacuum of space, through his heart. The stars. They were different, utterly and terrifyingly different. The familiar constellations, the navigation beacons, the faint, distant glows of settled imperial worlds, they were all gone, replaced by a breathtaking, yet deeply unsettling tableau. Vast, dark nebulae, previously unknown, drifted like colossal, predatory leviathans. Star clusters blazed with a fierce, unnatural light. And in the far distance, a titanic, ominous shadow. A swirling vortex of incandescent purple and black scarred the very fabric of the void, stretching across what felt like half the visible galaxy. It was a sight of such terrifying grandeur and utter wrongness that it stole his breath. He had seen picked captures of the Haydex anomaly, of the Eye of Terror. But this was something else. Larger, more pervasive. It felt like a wound in reality itself. Augurs, voxcasters, anything! Thorn roared, his voice trembling with a nascent dread he refused to acknowledge. Scan for imperial signals, fleet movements, anything recognizable. Tech priests, still struggling to regain full functionality, worked with the desperate urgency of men who knew their lives, and perhaps the fate of an entire regiment depended on their answers. Their metallic digits flew across damaged interfaces, binary canted prayers echoing through the ruined bridge. The answers, when they came, were worse than any Xenos invasion or demonkin assault. Negative, Colonel, rasped a junior Magos, his vocalizer spitting static. All long-range augurs show nothing. No imperial astropathic choir, no established vox channels, no warp signatures of common imperial vessels. Local space is empty of all standard traffic. Sensors are picking up residual grav signatures from what appear to be long-dead star systems. Colonel, added another tech priest. Faint, but consistent with terraformed worlds, but no active power signatures, no life signs, millennia of decay. Thorn's jaw clenched. Millennia. The Mago's earlier words echoed in his mind. Displacement. It wasn't just physical displacement. It was temporal. A horrifying, impossible temporal displacement. His men, his regiment, had been suspended in time. How long? He looked out at the alien stars again, his gaze drawn irrevocably to that colossal, purple-black tear in the cosmos. It pulsed, a silent, malevolent heart of the void. And in that moment, a chilling, undeniable truth began to form in his mind. A truth so terrible, it threatened to shatter the very foundations of his faith. The Imperium. His Imperium. The one he had sworn to protect. The one his ancestors had served for 10 millennia. It was gone. The sheer, monumental silence of the galaxy outside the Praxis Omega was the most terrifying thing of all. No distant chatter of vox comms, no faint hum of warp drives, no familiar Imperial light lanes, no comforting beacon from a nearby fortress world. Just the void, empty and vast, as if the Imperium had never existed. The station, a mere speck in this cosmic emptiness, felt like the last bastion of a forgotten age. Sergeant Kael, ever vigilant, noticed the profound shift in his colonel's demeanor. "Sir? What is it?" Thorn turned, his face a mask of grim, resolute control, though his eyes held a flicker of deep-seated horror. "Prepare the scout cutters, Sergeant. Fully armed, fully provisioned. Take a team. We are making planetfall on the nearest habitable world within range. And prepare the men. We are not alone. But whatever is out there, it is not what we remember. The weight of an unimaginable antiquity settled upon the bridge. The Vorlegian 7th had emerged, not victorious from a siege, but from a tomb of time, into a galaxy utterly alien and devoid of the familiar. The Emperor's light, once a guiding star, felt like a distant, flickering memory. But even in this profound darkness, the iron discipline of Vorlog held. They were guardsmen. Their duty was to the Imperium. And if the Imperium was gone, then by the Emperor, they would find it, or build it anew. The first seeds of their impossible crusade were sown in that moment of desolate realization. The descent was a slow, agonizing drop through an unfamiliar sky. 2 of the Vorlagian 7th's sturdy but ancient scout cutters their adamantium hulls scarred by forgotten battles, and their internal systems protesting vociferously after millennia of dormancy, broke through the upper atmosphere of the world designated Alpha 7 Rho. On the bridge of the lead cutter, Colonel Thorne gripped the armrests of his command chair, his gaze fixed on the main viewport. This wasn't merely a reconnaissance mission. It was a desperate quest for answers, a search for any vestige of the Imperium they had left behind. They had chosen Alpha 7 Rho not because it broadcast any recognizable Imperial signals, there were none, but because its atmospheric composition and gravimetric readings suggested a habitable, if untamed, world. Thorne had hoped for a supply depot, a forgotten research outpost, anything that could offer a link to their past. What unfurled beneath them as they pierced the cloud layer, however, was a landscape that twisted hope into a bitter ashes. The world was a riot of primeval jungle and towering, jagged mountains, bisected by sluggish, silt-choked rivers. Crude, sprawling settlements, mere hovels of mud, thatch, and scavenged metal, clung to the edges of vast, ancient ruins. These ruins, half swallowed by vegetation, bore the unmistakable, brutalist architecture of imperial construction. Yet they were utterly derelict, eroded by the wind and rain of countless forgotten centuries. No lights gleamed, no Vox traffic hummed, no automated defenses whirred to life, only the desolate silence of a graveyard. "No power signatures, sir," reported Lieutenant Varos, the cutter's pilot, his voice grim. "No active technology, just decay." "Set us down near that largest ruin complex," Thorne commanded, pointing to a particularly imposing structure that looked like the skeletal remains of a fortified hab block. "Prepare for full combat deployment. Assume hostile contact." The cutters touched down amidst a cloud of red dust and tearing jungle foliage, their landing skids kicking up ancient detritus. The ramp hissed down, revealing a humid, earthy air thick with the scent of unfamiliar flora and the distant, animalistic cries of unseen predators. Sergeant Kyle led the vanguard, his heavy stubber held at the ready, his eyes scanning the dense tree line. The Vorlagian 7th disembarked with practiced precision, forming a tight, disciplined perimeter around their landing zone. Their archaic but meticulously maintained equipment, from their heavy carapace armor to the gleaming barrels of their laser guns, stood in stark contrast to the primeval wilderness that surrounded them. It wasn't long before they encountered life. Shadows stirred in the jungle. Primitive, guttural shouts echoed from the tree line. The Vorlagians braced themselves, expecting feral beasts. What emerged, however, were figures disturbingly similar to themselves. They were human, undoubtedly, but these were not the citizens of the Imperium Thorn remembered. Clad in crude hides, adorned with bones and feathers, their skin tattooed with intricate, unholy symbols, they emerged from the undergrowth like ghosts from a forgotten age. Their faces were smeared with ochre and ash, their eyes wide with a mixture of terror and primordial aggression. They wielded sharpened spears, flint axes, and crudely fashioned bows, their movements agile and predatory. "Hold fire," Thorn ordered, raising a gauntleted hand. He stepped forward, his vox caster set to a universal hailing frequency. "Greetings. We are the Imperial Guard. We come in peace." His words, spoken in clear, standard, low Gothic, were met with blank stares and a chorus of chittering, guttural sounds. The primitive humans exchanged nervous glances, their eyes darting from the strange, armored giants to the thunderous landing craft. Then, one of them, a gaunt, tattooed elder, clutching a staff adorned with a rotting skull, shrieked. A single word, barely recognizable, ripped from his throat. "Demons!" Panic erupted. The primitives, spurred by their elder's cry, charged, a chaotic wave of spears and axes. The Vorlagian 7th, trained for the disciplined horrors of war, stood their ground. "Stun settings only," Thorn commanded, his voice tight. He would not slaughter these people, not yet, not until he understood. Overawe them. Do not spill blood unless absolutely necessary. Lass rifles spat beams of crimson light, not to kill, but to shock and disorient. Heavy stubbers roared, kicking up dirt and shattering branches around the charging natives, their rattling reports echoing like thunder. The primitives, utterly unprepared for such devastating, invisible force, scattered in terror, melting back into the jungle as quickly as they had appeared. Thorn turned to Sergeant Kael. "Secure the perimeter. No pursuit. Magos, begin scans. I want to know everything about this world, its history, its people." Over the next few days, a grim pattern emerged. The Vorlagian 7th established a temporary defensive perimeter within the largest ruin, a former Imperial Administratum complex. The ruins were a treasure trove of shattered clues, cracked data slates, devoid of power, littered what had once been offices. Broken cog-toothed gears of defunct machinery lay half-buried in the detritus. Everywhere there was evidence of a grand, advanced civilization, their civilization, that had been brought low by an unknown, cataclysmic event. The primitives, whom the Vorlagians tentatively dubbed ash-eaters, due to their practice of consuming ash from ancient fires, were encountered again. Through painstaking effort, using crude pict charts and the fragments of language they could discern, the stone hearts attempted to communicate. The ash eaters spoke a language Thorn slowly recognized as a deeply corrupted, fractured dialect of Low Gothic. Words like emperor, pronounced empra, star, pronounced star, and demon, pronounced daemon, occasionally surfaced, twisted and distorted, stripped of their original meaning. Their gods were not the emperor, but monstrous figures depicted in their cave paintings, figures with too many limbs, or eyes, or tentacles, vaguely reminiscent of warp entities Thorn had only ever seen in sanctioned pict captures from the Inquisition. They worshipped crude totems, practiced blood rituals, and lived in constant fear of the shadow, a pervasive, malevolent presence they spoke of in hushed, terrified whispers. One evening, while sifting through the collapsed central archive of the Administratum complex, Thorn made a discovery. Buried beneath tons of rubble and accumulated centuries of dust, he found a sealed, armored data vault. Its security mechanisms were complex, designed to resist millennia of decay and tampering. Thorn, with the reluctant assistance of Magos Kalen and a team of tech priests, spent 2 agonizing days carefully bypassing the archaic protocols, praying to the machine god and the Omnissiah for guidance. When the vault finally hissed open, revealing a chamber miraculously preserved from the elements, Thorn stepped inside, his heart pounding with a mixture of dread and hope. Shelves of ancient data slates, some still faintly humming with residual power, lined the walls. But it was a single holographic projector in the center of the room that drew his attention. It was active, albeit faintly, displaying a loop of static, as if waiting for a command. Magos Kalen, his optical sensors glowing with renewed intensity, cautiously interfaced with the device. A cascade of images flickered to life. Not propaganda, not imperial decrees, but fragmented historical records. Pict captures of star maps, familiar at first, then rapidly dissolving into chaotic blurs. Entire sectors of space vanishing or being consumed by that omnipresent purple-black tear in the fabric of reality. Vox logs, translated imperfectly by Kalen, spoke of the age of strife, the long night, the great crusade, and then, chillingly, the Horus heresy. Thorn watched, transfixed. As the timeline unfolded, he saw images of the Emperor, magnificent and terrible, leading his legions. He saw the betrayal, the civil war, the galaxy set aflame. He saw the grim, endless struggle of the post-heresy imperium, the rise of the ecclesiarchy, the endless wars against Xenos and heretic. And then the records grew sparse, fragmented, filled with increasingly desperate and cryptic messages, warnings of an encroaching darkness, a great silence, a shadow across the stars. Finally, a single, unblinking image filled the holographic field. It was a macro-pict of the galaxy, and spanning its entire length, bisecting it from galactic north to south, was the colossal, iridescent tear he had seen from the Praxis Omega's viewports. The Great Rift. And beneath it, a chilling, final data entry dated untold millennia after his own time. The Imperium divides. All astropathic choirs silenced. Terra isolated. The age of the Dark Imperium begins. Thorn stood there, utterly motionless, as the cold, hard truth slammed into him with the force of an exterminatus weapon. Not just gone, but fundamentally altered, shattered beyond recognition, racked by a cataclysm of unimaginable scale. The Imperium he had sworn his life to, the beacon of humanity, the invincible realm, had fallen. It had endured, yes, but only as a scarred, broken parody of its former glory, its very heart torn apart by forces he could barely comprehend. His mind reeled, attempting to reconcile this monumental horror with everything he knew, everything he believed. It was impossible. Yet the evidence was before him, stark and undeniable. The alien stars, the derelict ruins, the feral humans worshipping diamond gods, the shattered echoes of an imperium that had crumbled into dust. He felt a profound, aching emptiness, a void opening up in his soul. Despair, an insidious whisper, coiled around his heart, urging him to surrender, to embrace the oblivion. What was the point? What was left to fight for? The Emperor, surely, could not have allowed this. Or perhaps even the Emperor had failed. He looked at the faces of his men, gathered just outside the vault, their expressions a mixture of confusion and growing dread as they absorbed the fragmented reports. Their unwavering loyalty, their simple, profound faith, rested on the foundation of an imperium that no longer existed. He was their colonel, their leader, their rock. And in this moment, his own rock felt like sand crumbling beneath him. But then something hardened within him, a stubborn, unyielding defiance born of Vorlog. They had survived the impossible. They had emerged from a tomb of time. And if the Imperium was shattered, If humanity was reduced to worshipping demons, then it was their duty, the sacred burden of the Vorlagian 7th Armored Infantry, to pick up the pieces, to find what remained, to uplift what was fallen, to cleanse what was corrupted. He would not let despair consume them. He would not allow the Emperor's light to be extinguished, not while a single stone heart drew breath. The Imperium was gone, but they would build it again. From ash and blood, they would reclaim it. A new, impossible purpose ignited in Colonel Thorne's grim, weary eyes. The air in the makeshift command center, the miraculously intact central hall of the Administratum complex, now fortified with sandbags and hastily erected barricades, was thick with the dust of ages and the suffocating weight of an impossible truth. Colonel Caelan Thorne stood before his assembled officers, the shattered holographic projections still flickering behind him, casting long, distorted shadows that danced like specters of the past. The findings from the data vault had been disseminated, the grim news filtering through the regiment like a silent, viral plague. Despair was a tangible entity, pressing in on all sides, threatening to crush the very spirit of the Vorlagian 7th. Thorne watched his men, his heart a leaden weight in his chest. Sergeant Kyle, usually an unyielding pillar of stoicism, stared blankly at a cracked viewport, his hands clenched into white-knuckled fists. Lieutenant Varos, the pilot, slumped in a chair, his face pale and drawn, muttering to himself in low, choked whispers. Even Commissar Anya Kreska, her usually impassive features carved from granite, showed a faint tremor in her jawline, a hairline crack in her formidable resolve. The news had struck them all, not as a physical blow, but as a psychic one, severing the very roots of their identity. The Imperium, their reason for being, gone, reduced to ash and scattered fragments. For a long moment, Thorne let the silence hang, heavy and suffocating. He allowed the despair to wash over him, to touch the deepest parts of his soul. He had seen countless horrors in his long service, faced Xenos monstrosities, and routed cultist hordes. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared him for this. The temptation to simply lay down his chain Zord, to tell his men to abandon all hope and seek whatever peace a meaningless death might offer, was a whisper in the back of his mind, a seductive, dark promise of oblivion. What was the point of struggling when the very thing they struggled for had ceased to exist? But then, a different voice echoed in his memory. The voices of his ancestors, the generations of Vorlagian warriors who had held the line against insurmountable odds. The stoic, unyielding spirit of his homeworld, where life was harsh, and only the stubbornly resolute survived. The image of the emperor on his chainsword's hilt, a silent, eternal rebuke to despair. He saw the faces of his men again, their grim, weary eyes looking to him for guidance, for answers, for anything to cling to. They were lost, adrift in a hostile galaxy, clinging to a faith that now seemed a cruel joke. And in that moment, Thorn knew he could not falter. He was their colonel. He was the Stoneheart. If he broke, they all broke. He straightened, his heavy carapace armor creaking faintly, a sound like ancient stone shifting. His voice, when he finally spoke, was a low rumble, but it carried the weight of command, the iron will of a man who had chosen to stand against the tide. "Dismissed," he said to his officers, his gaze sweeping over them, assessing, demanding. "Prepare the men, all personnel, full assembly in 1 hour, main plaza." There was no questioning, no hesitation. The Vorlagian 7th, even in the depths of their shock, understood the implicit command. This was it, the moment of truth. An hour later, under the twin alien suns of Alpha 7 Rho, the surviving members of the Vorlagian 7th Armored Infantry stood assembled. Their numbers were diminished, perhaps a quarter of their original strength after the initial incident and subsequent skirmishes. But they stood in perfect, disciplined ranks, their heavy, archaic armor gleaming dull in the strange light, their lace guns held rigidly. They looked like statues, defiant against a landscape that screamed of forgotten ages. Commissar Kreska stood at Thorn's side, her bolt pistol ostentatiously held, her gaze unwavering, ready to enforce discipline, or perhaps to offer a grim, silent testament to their last stand. Colonel Thorn strode to the center of the improvised parade ground, the ground crunching under his heavy boots. He removed his helmet, revealing a face etched with lines of command and sorrow, but also with an unwavering, fierce resolve. His gaze swept over every man and woman, meeting their eyes directly, seeing the fear, the confusion, the terrible gnawing emptiness. "You have heard the reports," Thorn began, his voice amplified by a vox-hailer cutting through the heavy silence. His words were not a speech, but a blunt statement of fact, a hammer blow of truth. "We have been gone for an indeterminate amount of time, millennia. The Imperium we knew, it is shattered. The great rift tears the galaxy in half. Terra itself is isolated. Our astropathic choirs are silent. Humanity is fragmented, reduced in many places to barbarism, worshipping shadows and twisted idols. He paused, letting the full horror of his words sink in, watching the subtle flinches, the tightening of jaws. He knew some would be questioning their very sanity. The enemy. They are stronger than we remember. The warp's taint is deeper. The Xenos are more numerous. We are but a ghost from a forgotten age, armed with equipment that is ancient, doctrines that are obsolete, standing on a forgotten world. Everything we fought for, everything we believed in, has been brought to ruin. A tremor rippled through the ranks. Thorn felt the collective despair, a palpable force. It was here, at this lowest ebb, that the Vorlesian spirit would either break or harden into something unbreakable. Despair, Thorn continued, his voice now rising, gaining power, is a luxury we cannot afford. Surrender is not in our blood. We are the stone hearts of Vorlag. We do not yield. We do not break. We endure. He raised his chainsword, the relic blade gleaming. The Emperor's effigy on its hilt caught the alien sunlight, a faint, defiant spark. The Imperium is not a place. It is not a system of government. It is not even just the Emperor's realm. It is an ideal. It is the unwavering faith of humanity. It is our duty. And that duty, guardsman, has not changed. He slammed the butt of his chainsword into the ground, the sound echoing like a thunderclap. They say the Imperium is gone. I say they are wrong. The Imperium lives. It lives in us, in our discipline, in our courage, in our unwavering faith in the Master of mankind. His voice became a roar, filled with a grim, righteous fury that ignited a spark in the hearts of his men. If the Imperium is shattered, then we shall gather its pieces. If humanity is lost in darkness, then we shall be its light. If its people worship false gods, then we shall remind them of the true God. We are the last bastion of what was. And by the Emperor's will, we shall be the first stone of what will be. He swept his arm across the primeval landscape, encompassing the jungle, the ruined hab blocks, the very soil beneath their feet. This world, these people, they are the first to be reclaimed, the first to be brought back into the light. We are not retreating, we are not abandoning our post. We are embarking on the greatest crusade ever conceived. A crusade to reclaim a lost empire, to rebuild the Imperium, one world, one soul, one bullet at a time. He looked to Commissar Kreska. Her expression was now devoid of doubt, replaced by a fierce, almost fanatical light in her eyes. "Commissar," he barked, "is there any man here who questions his duty? Any man who denies the Emperor's will?" Kreska stepped forward, her bolt pistol now raised, aimed not at the men, but at the sky, a symbol of their defiance. Her voice, usually sharp and cutting, was now a deep, resonant echo of Thorn's own conviction. "Let it be known. We are the Imperium's chosen. We are its shield, its sword, its very heart. For 10,000 years we have held the line. For 10,000 more we shall continue. We are the Stone Hearts, and we will break before we bend." A ripple went through the assembled guardsmen. A low murmur, then a single, guttural shout. "For the Emperor!" Another, then another, growing in strength until the plaza vibrated with a unified roar. "For the Emperor! For Vorlag! For the Imperium!" It was not a cheer of triumph, but a defiant oath, forged in the crucible of despair. It was the sound of a regiment, broken and lost, finding a new, impossible purpose in the utter annihilation of their past. They would rebuild, not the Imperium as it was, but as they remembered it, as it should be. They would be its foundation, its steel skeleton, its unforgiving will. Armed with their ancient, heavy equipment, symbols of a bygone era, now imbued with a grim, new significance, and their unshakable faith, the Vorlagian 7th Armored Infantry, the Stonehearts of Vorlag, had taken a solemn oath to reclaim the stars, one blood-soaked step at a time, for an emperor who might no longer remember them, in a galaxy that had long forgotten their name. The oath sworn in the ancient plaza of Alpha 7 Row, now christened New Vorlag, was not a mere declaration. It was a covenant forged in the furnace of existential despair. For Colonel Thorn and the Vorlagian 7th, it meant not just survival, but the monumental task of recreating an empire from scratch. Their first imperial outpost began, fittingly, with the arduous process of taming the primeval wilderness and imposing order upon the feral ash-eaters. The Stonehearts applied their centuries-old tactical doctrines and engineering principles with grim, unyielding determination. Their initial focus was on establishing a secure perimeter. Heavy stubber emplacements were mounted atop the crumbling walls of the Administratum complex, their archaic servitors, salvaged and painstakingly reactivated by Magos Kalen's team, patrolling the perimeters with the slow, deliberate grind of ancient clockwork. Automated sentry guns, pre-heresy designs of terrifying reliability, were carefully unearthed, repaired, and emplaced, their optical sensors sweeping the encroaching jungle. Next came the vital task of resource extraction. The Praxis Omega, still orbiting high above, became their floating forge and factory. Its vast hold contained reserves of promethium, metals, and spare parts that, while finite, were far beyond anything the primitive world below could offer. Shuttle flights, slow and precarious, ferried down equipment and specialists. Tech priests, grumbling binary curses, but driven by their own zeal, established crude but effective mining operations, focusing on the rich veins of heavy metals and rare earths they detected in the mountains surrounding their base. Lass drills, their beams cutting through rock with terrifying precision, replaced manual labor, gradually carving out rudimentary roads and clearings. The real challenge, however, lay in the human element. The Ash Eaters, numbering in the tens of thousands across the continent, were initially hostile, viewing the armored giants and their thundering machines as a new, more powerful breed of demon. Patrols were met with ambushes of spears and crude bows, their warriors fueled by desperation and a deeply ingrained fear of outsiders. But the Vorlagians did not retaliate with lethal force. Thorn had given strict orders. Overawe, do not exterminate. We are here to reclaim them, not to bury them. Instead, the Stonehearts showcased their might. Skirmish lines of guardsmen, their laser guns firing blinding volleys over the heads of attackers, would drive off aggressive tribes. Armored personnel carriers, salvaged and brought back online with immense effort, rumbled through the jungle, their heavy stubbers swiveling menacingly, their sheer presence enough to scatter entire war bands. But more potent than fear was the allure of their technology. The Vorlagians built clean water purifiers, powered by geothermal taps, offering crystal-clear water where only disease-ridden muck had been. They established crude Medici outposts, manned by a handful of surviving Medici servitors and field medics, offering treatments for ailments that had decimated the Ash Eaters for generations. They demonstrated the ability to generate warmth and light, to cook food without fire, to repel the local fauna that had plagued their settlements. Slowly, cautiously, the Ash Eaters began to observe. Some, driven by curiosity or the desperate needs of their sick and starving, approached the Vorlagian perimeter. They were met not with violence, but with stern, disciplined invitations to join. The Stonehearts offered them basic rations, warm clothing salvaged from the Praxis Omega, and, most importantly, protection. Thorn, with the unwavering assistance of Commissar Kreska, initiated a brutal yet effective re-education program. Using picked slates and salvaged projectors, They displayed images of the Emperor, of the vast, glorious Imperium as they remembered it. They taught the corrupted Low Gothic, painstakingly correcting the twisted pronunciations, imbuing words like loyalty, duty, and faith with their true, sacred meanings. They replaced the crude, demon-like idols of the ash-eaters with simple, iconic aquilus, carved from rock or metal. Kreska was particularly instrumental in this. Her presence alone, radiating an aura of unyielding authority, was often enough to cow resistant tribesmen. She oversaw the Acolyte Corps, a brutal but necessary training program for the fittest of the ash-eaters, teaching them basic discipline, imperial prayers, and rudimentary combat skills. These new recruits, clad in scavenged fatigues and armed with flintlock rifles or repurposed auto pistols, became a buffer between the Stonehearts and the remaining wild tribes, their loyalty earned through the potent combination of fear and the promise of a better, safer life. Within a standard Terran year, New Vorlog had transformed. What was once a collection of crumbling ruins was now a fortified bastion, its walls patched with new ferrocrete and bristling with reactivated defenses. Beyond its walls, a rudimentary agricultural sector had sprung up, cultivated by ash-eaters under the watchful eyes of Vorlagian agricultural specialists, their yields far exceeding anything the primitives had achieved before. A small but growing population of new Vorlagians now lived within the safety of the perimeter, their children growing up hearing tales of the glorious Emperor and the vast Imperium, learning the ancient songs of duty and sacrifice. This initial success was a testament not only to the Vorlagians' advanced technology and disciplined ferocity, but also to their unwavering, almost fanatical faith. They saw every cleansed ruin, every converted tribe, every crop harvested, as a step towards reclaiming the lost glory of the Imperium. Colonel Thorne, though weary, felt a grim satisfaction. They were not merely surviving. They were building. They were the architects of a new, if painfully small and isolated, fragment of humanity's empire. One evening, as the twin suns dipped below the horizon, casting long, crimson shadows across the nascent fortress, Thorne stood on the highest battlements with Commissar Kreska. Below them, the lights of New Vorlog flickered, a tiny, defiant beacon in the overwhelming darkness. They adapt quickly, Kreska observed, her gaze sweeping over the bustling compound below, where the transformed ash-eaters now went about their tasks with a newfound purpose. Their faith is fragile, but it takes root. fragile, but present," Thorn affirmed, his voice a low rumble. "That is enough for now, Commissar. We give them order, safety, and a cause greater than themselves. They will learn." He paused, looking out at the endless jungle, the silent, alien stars. "This is but the first stone, Anya. The first step on a road of 1,000 millennia." Kreska nodded slowly. "And the road ahead will be paved with blood, Colonel. Their blood and ours. We have shown them the light. But the galaxy is full of things that thrive in the dark." As if on cue, a distant, guttural howl echoed from the jungle, a sound that was not entirely animal. It was a mournful, hungry cry, carrying with it an ancient malice. Thorn tightened his grip on the battlements, his eyes narrowing. Kreska was right. Their nascent imperium, their fragile ember of hope, was a beacon that would inevitably attract attention. The true horrors of the 41st millennium had not yet fully revealed themselves. Their initial success was merely a prelude, a brief respite before the real struggle began. The first foundation was laid, yes, but the serpent was already stirring in the garden. The ominous howl that had pierced the night at New Vorlog was not an isolated incident. Over the ensuing weeks, a disquieting pattern emerged. Patrols reported strange tracks in the jungle, too many limbs, too sharp claws, unlike any indigenous fauna. Sentries swore they heard whispering in the darkness, not the familiar gibberish of the still feral ash-eaters, but something more insidious, a murmur that crawled into the mind like a parasite. Livestock went missing, not slaughtered for food, but meticulously eviscerated, their entrails arranged in grotesque, ritualistic patterns. Fear, a primordial dread, began to creep back into the hearts of the newly uplifted New Vorlagians, their fragile faith in the Emperor's protection wavering. Colonel Thorn, his senses honed by countless campaigns against the myriad horrors of the galaxy, recognized the signs. This was not the work of simple predators or rogue tribes. This was something else, something intelligent, something malevolent. Magos Kalen's Wansha range scans, still imperfect from the trauma of the time dilation bubble, had detected unusual biosignatures emanating from deep within the jungle, rapidly multiplying. Xenos, Kalen had declared with a chilling certainty, of an unknown yet highly aggressive genotype. The truth was far, far worse. It began with the children, a handful of New Vorlagian children, already isolated or deemed unfit by their own primitive society before the Stonehearts arrived, began to disappear. Then their distraught parents, too terrified to speak openly, approached the Vorlagian guardsmen with whispered tales of unsettling changes. Their kin, returned from the jungle after supposed vision quests, spoke of a star brother who loved them, who promised them a glorious future among the stars, a future free from the strictures of the armored giants. These star brothers were said to have eyes like black pearls and smiles that stretched too wide, and they spoke in voices that resonated with a hypnotic, unsettling charm. Commissar Kreska, with her grim insight into the insidious nature of heresy, immediately suspected a cult. She deployed her most trusted shock troops, a handful of surviving veterans augmented by the newly trained Acolyte Corps, to investigate the burgeoning descent. They returned with grim findings: crude altars bearing grotesquely fashioned idols, not of the Emperor, but of a multi-limbed, chittering horror, offerings of fresh blood and still beating hearts left before them. And, most chillingly, the discovery of crude, hand-drawn pictograms depicting the Vorlagian guardsmen themselves, not as saviors, but as oppressive, false idols to be overthrown. The serpent in the garden had revealed its true form: a nascent genestealer cult, already deeply embedded within the primitive population. It was a foe unlike any the Vorlagians had encountered in their own time. They were warriors of the Imperium. They knew how to fight orc hordes, chaos cultists, and minor Xenos breeds. But the genestealer cult was a foe that preyed on the very fabric of society, corrupting from within, turning the innocent into monstrous thralls. Colonel Thorne convened an emergency council. "This changes everything," he stated, his voice devoid of emotion, yet radiating a cold fury. "This is not a simple pacification. This is an infestation. These creatures seek to twist our own recruits, to turn our nascent Imperium against itself." Sergeant Kael slammed a fist on the table. "They hide among the populace, Colonel. How do we fight an enemy that wears the faces of our charges?" Commissar Kreska's answer was swift and brutal. "With fire, with purification. The Emperor's mercy for such abominations is swift oblivion. We cannot allow this cancer to spread." Thorne grimaced. He had sought to reclaim these people, to uplift them. Now he was being forced to contemplate their slaughter. But he knew Kreska was right. There was no negotiation with a genestealer cult. Only eradication. The first major confrontation came swiftly. A large group of ash-eaters, their numbers bolstered by grotesque, malformed hybrids, launched a sudden, coordinated assault on New Vorlog's northern gate. They moved with an unnatural speed, Their human shouts mingled with the chittering cries of their alien masters. They threw themselves against the reinforced walls, their primitive weapons clashing against adamantium, their minds utterly consumed by the hypnotic thrall of the patriarch. The Vorlagian, 7th, met them with disciplined fire. Laser guns whined, their beams cutting through the charging mass. Heavy stubbers thundered, scything down hybrids with bursts of explosive rounds. Meltaguns, their archaic power packs humming ominously, boiled flesh and slagged crude armor. But the sheer fanaticism of the cultists was terrifying. They ignored losses, clambering over their fallen brethren, driven by an unholy zeal. Then, the pure strain Genestealers emerged from the jungle, moving with a horrifying agility, their claws rending ferrocrete, their chitinous bodies absorbing bolt gun fire with chilling resilience. These were the monsters of forbidden Pictlogs, the very nightmares of the galactic dark. The Vorlagian guardsmen, accustomed to the predictable patterns of warfare, were shaken by their speed, their ferocity, their ability to tear apart a fully armored guardsman in a matter of seconds. "Hold the line! Do not break!" Kael roared, his chainsword revving to life, cutting a swath through a charging wave of hybrid aberrations. His heavy carapace armor was already scored with claw marks, his breathing heavy. Colonel Thorn, leading from the front, brought his chainsword down on a hybrid's skull, its mutated head exploding in a spray of purple blood. His bolter barked, spitting explosive shells that tore through cultist ranks. He watched in grim horror as one of his veteran guardsmen, Corporal Jax, was dragged screaming into the shadows by a pure strain Genestealer, his armored form torn apart with sickening ease. The combat was close quarters, brutal, and terrifyingly intimate. Magos Kalen, perched precariously on a battlement's catwalk, directed his reactivated servitors, their multi-lasers and autoguns spitting death into the onrushing hordes. His augurs screamed, attempting to pinpoint the source of the cult's psychic control. The Patriarch! It's deep within the tunnel network, beneath the old administratum. It's controlling them. Thorn knew what he had to do. The cult could not be simply repelled. It had to be decapitated. "Sergeant Kale, with me, lead a breach team. We're going to hunt this monster in its lair." Commissar Kreska, her face a mask of grim determination, moved to intercept a group of hybrids attempting to scale a wall. "I'll hold the gate, Colonel. Bring back its head." First, ensuing hunt through the subterranean tunnels beneath New Vorlag was a claustrophobic nightmare. The tunnels, once service access ways, were now expanded into a sprawling warren, fouled with Xeno's ichor, chitinous husks, and the grotesque effigies of the genestealer cult. The air was thick with the cloying, sickly sweet scent of alien biology and the metallic tang of fear. Every shadow seemed to conceal a waiting horror. Kael and his squad, their heavy carapace armor clanging in the confined spaces, fought with a desperate ferocity. Lass fire flashed in the darkness. Bolter rounds tore through plaster and flesh, and the wet, tearing sounds of chain zords meeting alien biology echoed through the earth. Casualties mounted. The genestealers, adapted to the dark, struck from every angle, their claws like razors, their speed a blur. Finally, in a vast, excavated chamber, deep beneath the complex, they found it. The Patriarch. A colossal, bloated horror, its psychic presence an oppressive weight that crushed the mind, its multiple eyes glowing with malevolent intelligence. Around it, its favored brood, the hulking, muscular aberrants, guarded their master. The battle that followed was desperate and savage. The Vorlagians, their numbers dwindling, fired every round, swung every blade, screamed every prayer. Thorn, fueled by a righteous fury, engaged the Patriarch directly, his chain zord roaring, its adamantium teeth tearing at the creature's thick carapace. He moved with a speed that belied his age, driven by the horrifying realization of what these creatures meant for his impossible dream of rebuilding the Imperium. The Patriarch was a monstrous opponent, its claws deflecting blows, its sheer bulk crushing men beneath its weight. Its psychic whispers burrowed into their minds, attempting to unravel their faith, to break their resolve. But the stone hearts, forged in the grim crucible of Vorlag, had a will of iron. They endured. They fought. Finally, after what seemed an eternity of blood and fury, Thorn plunged his chain zord into the Patriarch's skull, ripping through chitin and brain matter with a sickening crunch. The creature spasmed, its psychic scream echoing through the tunnels, a dying shriek of pure malevolence that sent shivers down their spines. Then, with a final, shuddering collapse, it fell. The immediate effect was profound. The thrall holding the cultists above ground broke. Their fanatical charge faltered, their eyes losing their glazed, unholy light. Confusion, then terror, replaced their zeal. Those who could fled back into the jungle, leaving behind the dead and the dying. The Vorlagian 7th had won their first major victory in this new, terrifying galaxy. But the cost was immense. As Thorn emerged from the tunnels, his armor scored and dented, his chain sword dripping Xenos ichor. He looked upon the carnage. Scores of his men lay dead, their heavy carapace armor mangled, their bodies torn asunder. Irreplaceable. Equipment was damaged or destroyed. And among the fallen were countless new Vorlagians, both cultist and innocent, caught in the horrific crossfire. The cost of reclaiming even a single world for the Emperor, of fighting the hidden serpent in the garden, was paid in blood, shattered faith, and the bitter realization that this new imperium would be built on a mountain of countless corpses. The Stonehearts had learned their first lesson in the grim, dark truth of the 41st millennium. The aftermath of the Genestealer cult uprising was a grim tableau of Pyrrhic victory. New Vorlag, though saved from utter annihilation, bore the scars of the brutal conflict like weeping wounds. The northern gate was a mangled ruin, its ferrocrete gouged and rent by alien claws. The perimeter, once a proud symbol of imperial order, was littered with the bodies of cultists and hybrids, their grotesque forms slowly cooling in the humid air. And among them, with heart-wrenching frequency, lay the familiar, heavy carapace armor of the Vorlagian Seventh, twisted and broken, their lives extinguished in the desperate struggle. Colonel Thorne walked the battlements in the dawn light, the sickly sweet scent of alien ichor and spilled blood clinging to the air. His face was a mask of grim exhaustion, his eyes haunted by the faces of his fallen men and the sheer, overwhelming horror of the enemy they had just faced. They had lost nearly a third of their remaining fighting strength in the battle. Irreplaceable heavy stubbers were shattered, their barrels fused. A single, precious Lehman Russ battle tank, salvaged from the Praxis Omega with immense effort, had taken a catastrophic hit from a particularly large aberrant, and was now little more than a burned-out husk. Every loss was magnified 100-fold. There were no reinforcements, no supply lines stretching back to a glorious imperium. They were utterly alone. Commissar Kreska moved among the surviving new Vorlagians, her presence a chilling balm of order amidst the chaos. Those who had been thralls to the cult were rounded up, their eyes still wide with a terrible dawning comprehension of the monstrosities they had become. Kreska's judgments were swift and unyielding. The utterly corrupted, those whose mutations were too pronounced or whose minds were too far gone, were purified with a bolt round or a short burst of las fire, their souls grimly commended to the Emperor. The less afflicted, those who showed signs of remorse or were merely innocent victims of the cult's insidious influence, were given a stark choice: dedicate themselves utterly to the Emperor and the Stonehearts, or face the same grim fate. The lessons of loyalty and the true nature of heresy were etched into their hearts with cold steel and colder resolve. The immediate task was purification and reconstruction. Magos. Kalen and his tech priests worked tirelessly, their servitors hauling away the dead, salvaging what little remained of the destroyed equipment, and attempting to repair the damaged fortifications. The Ash Eaters, now truly humbled and terrified, worked alongside them, their previous contempt for the armored demons replaced by a desperate gratitude and a newfound, fervent belief in the Emperor's protection and the Stoneheart's capacity for brutal retribution. Thorn oversaw the grim rites for the fallen guardsmen. Each body was carefully retrieved, stripped of usable equipment, and given a simple, dignified burial in the consecrated soil outside New Vorlag. Their names were read aloud, their deeds recounted, their sacrifices etched into the regiment's oral history. Thorn delivered the eulogy himself, his voice raw with grief and exhaustion, yet unwavering in its conviction. They died for the Emperor. They died for the Imperium. Their sacrifice shall not be in vain. Their spirit lives on in every stone we lay, every foe we vanquish, every soul we reclaim. But the victory, hard won as it was, had come at a profound cost, not just in lives, but in the very nature of their mission. The dream of a benevolent, uplifting Imperium, of gently guiding lost humanity back into the light, had been shattered. They had been forced to kill those they sought to save. They had discovered a horror that lurked not just outside their walls, but within the hearts and minds of the very people they were tasked to reclaim. The galaxy was not just empty, it was infested. The concept of reclaiming was now irrevocably stained with blood and compromise. The Vorlagians were forced to shed the last vestiges of their naive idealism. Their methods had to become harsher, their vigilance absolute. Every new tribe encountered, every nascent community brought into the fold would now be subject to the terrifying scrutiny of the Commissariat to root out the insidious taint of the Xenos or the whispers of chaos before they could fester. They had learned that mercy in this age was a luxury that often led to catastrophic ruin. One evening, as Thorn sat alone in his command office, meticulously cleaning his chainsword, Commissar Kreska entered without knocking. Her heavy boots echoed softly on the ferrocrete floor. She poured herself a ration can of nutrient paste, her movements economical and precise. "The children," she said, her voice unusually subdued. "The ones who were taken first. We found them, mutated beyond recognition, too far gone." She paused, her eyes usually hard as flint, holding a flicker of distant sorrow. "Even by my standards, Colonel, it was difficult." Thorn nodded, his gaze fixed on the gleaming teeth of his blade. He didn't need to ask what "too far gone" meant. He knew. "The cost of progress, Commissar, the price of rebuilding." "Indeed," Kreska agreed, taking a slow sip from her can. "But it changes us, Colonel. This fight. We came here to build an empire of light. We are becoming something else, something harder, more brutal, just to survive." "Survival is the Emperor's will," Thorn countered, his voice flat. "And brutality is a tool, Commissar. One we must wield if we are to prevail. There is no gentle path in this galaxy. Not anymore. Not when the enemy preys on innocence itself." He looked up, his eyes meeting hers, a shared understanding of the grim path they were now forced to walk. "We will make hard choices, Anya. We will do what must be done for the Imperium, for what it should be, even if it means we become the very monsters we fight in the eyes of others." Kreska held his gaze, a flicker of acknowledgement passing between them. "Then let us ensure we do not forget why we wield those tools, Colonel, or we truly will be lost." The victory against the Genestealer cult had been a transformative crucible. It had stripped away any lingering illusions the Stonehearts might have held about the ease of their mission. They were not merely explorers rediscovering a lost world. They were crusaders against an omnipresent, insidious darkness that had permeated every corner of the galaxy. Their archaic equipment, once a point of pride, was now revealed as fragile against the horrors of the 41st millennium. Their doctrines, once immutable, now had to be adapted, twisted, and brutalized to meet foes they had never conceived. The Stonehearts of Vorlog were no longer simply guardsmen. They were something new, something grim, something forged in the fires of impossible odds and unending sacrifice. Their faith remained, but it was a faith tempered by horror, hardened by necessity, and stained indelibly with the blood of those they had failed to save, and those they had been forced to destroy. The first step of their long, brutal crusade had been taken, and the cost had been paid in full. The true, terrifying scale of their task was now brutally clear. The hard-won, yet devastating victory against the Genestealer. Cult at New Vorlag cemented the grim realities of the 41st millennium for the Stonehearts. Their understanding of the galaxy's insidious horrors had deepened, but their resources were critically depleted. The loss of a Lehman Russ, the damage to their scout cutters, and the attrition of their lasgun power packs and bolter ammunition drove home an urgent truth. They needed more equipment, more fuel, more spare parts, and desperately, more information. The orbiting Praxis Omega, while a lifeline, could not sustain them indefinitely. Colonel Thorne directed Magos Kalen to initiate long-range astrogational scans, pushing the battered Praxis Omega's sensors to their absolute limits. They sought not just habitable worlds, but anomalies, energy signatures, anything that might indicate forgotten Imperial outposts, or even more crucially, dormant Mechanicus facilities. The Imperium of their time had been a vast, interconnected web of planets, and surely, somewhere, a forgotten forge world, or a supply depot lay awaiting discovery. Weeks of painstaking scanning yielded little but the ubiquitous silence of the void. The immense purple-black tear in reality, the Great Rift, remained a constant, ominous presence, a cosmic barrier across the stars. However, on the far edge of their maximum sensor range, a faint, almost imperceptible energy signature flickered. It was weak, intermittent, and dangerously close to the maelstrom of the rift, but it was unmistakably artificial. More specifically, it bore the spectral imprint of a warp drive, flickering erratically, like a dying heart. "It's a vessel," Magos Kalen reported, his optical sensors whirring with renewed interest. "Of an unknown classification, minimal power, heavily damaged, drifting." "Any Imperial markings?" Thorne pressed, a flicker of hope swiftly extinguished in his eyes. Kalen's metallic digits danced across a damaged console. "Negative. Signal is too corrupted, but it is broadcasting something. Astropathic echoes, fragmented, distorted." Thorne grimaced. Astropathic echoes could be anything: dying prayers, mad ravings, the psychic residue of a century-dead crew. But it was a signal, and in this silent galaxy, any signal was a beacon. "Prepare the remaining scout cutters. Maximum armament. Magos, assign your most stable servitors. We are investigating." The journey to the drifting vessel was long and fraught with peril. As they drew closer to the Great Rift, the void began to shimmer with unsettling colors. The Geller fields of the cutters hummed with strain, battling against unseen currents of raw warp energy. Thorn could feel the presence of the abyss, a cold, hungry vastness that threatened to swallow them whole. The vessel itself was a ghost. It was a sleek, elongated craft, unlike any imperial design Thorn recognized, yet its internal architecture bore a haunting familiarity. Its hull was ruptured in multiple places, gaping wounds that exposed ruined decks and vacuum-frozen sections. The outside was coated in a thick layer of space dust and micro-meteorite impacts, making it appear ancient, as though it too had drifted for millennia. They boarded through a ruptured section of the midship, their heavy boots clanging on the unresponsive deck plating. The air inside was cold, stale, and smelled of ozone and something else, something faintly metallic, like old blood. The emergency lighting was sporadic, casting long, dancing shadows. Thorn ordered his men to maintain a tight formation, their lace guns sweeping the darkness. What they found inside sent a chill deeper than the void through the stone hearts. The vessel was a navigator ship, though of a model far more advanced and baroque than any Thorn had seen in his time. Its central astropathic chamber was a twisted charnel house. The navigators, or what remained of them, were hideous parodies of humanity, their third eyes gaping pits of corruption, their bodies elongated, their skin slithering with faint, iridescent scales. They were dead, or worse, fused with their control panels, their skeletal forms frozen in postures of eternal agony, their psychic echoes still resonating through the ship's structure like a choir of tortured souls. "By the Emperor," Sergeant Kyle breathed, his voice hoarse, his heavy stubber trembling slightly in his grip. He had seen mutated men before, but never anything so profoundly corrupted. Magos Kalen, his servitors systematically scanning the ghastly scene, confirmed their worst fears. Warp touched. Heavily. Exposed to raw warp energy for an extended period. The entire crew. Beyond salvation. But amidst the horror, there was information. The central console of the astropathic chamber, though damaged, still flickered with fragmented data. Magos Kalen, with his characteristic disregard for personal safety, began to interface, careful not to touch the corrupted remains of the navigator fused to the console. What streamed from the console was not a clear message, but a torrent of fragmented, psychic data bursts. Images flashed through Thorn's mind, unbidden and terrifying. Visions of a galaxy torn asunder, of demonic legions pouring from the great rift, of worlds burning, of the Emperor's light fading, eclipsed by a colossal, malevolent shadow. He saw picked captures of ships, hundreds of thousands of them, fleeing before an unseen horror, only to be consumed by the swirling maelstrom of the rift. Then came the voices, distorted and overlapping, a babble of dying astropaths screaming into the void, words and phrases snatched from the torrent resonated with chilling clarity. Call's great work, Primaris, Guilliman returned, the Indomitus crusade, the Cicatrix maledictum, the dark imperium. Thorn felt his mind reel. Call, Primaris, Guilliman? The Primarchs were legendary, ancient heroes of the Horus heresy, long gone from the galaxy. Guilliman, the Lord of Ultramar, had been interred in stasis for 10,000 years. And the Dark Imperium, the Cicatrix maledictum? These were terms alien to him, yet they spoke of a galaxy utterly transformed, a desperate, unimaginable struggle far beyond anything he had conceived. The most potent revelation, however, came from the final, desperate log entry, flickering faintly on a screen that had somehow survived. It was a fleet communique, time-stamped millennia after the Vorlagian Seventh had vanished. It spoke of a vast imperial fleet attempting to navigate the precarious warp routes near the Great Rift, carrying vital supplies and new forces to Segmentum Obscurus, now severed from Terra. The fleet had been battered, scattered, and ultimately overwhelmed by an unprecedented surge of warp energy. Their last known trajectory, before their astropathic choir was silenced, was towards the region of space where Alpha 7 Rho, their new Vorlag, resided. They were seeking a refuge world, a safe haven. And then, the final, chilling whisper from the dying ship. A navigational chart, barely coherent, but clearly marking a series of stellar systems. One of them, designated Xylos Prime, was identified as a dormant forge world, suspected of pre-heresy capabilities, last known to be operational before the Great Silence. Its location was dangerously close to the turbulent edges of the Great Rift, but it was also relatively within their current reach. Thorn felt a cold dread, but also a fierce, desperate surge of purpose. This was it. This was the lifeline they needed. A forge world, perhaps dormant, perhaps lost to heresy, but a source of technology, of resources, of the means to repair and rearm, and the revelation of Guilliman's return, of a dark imperium still fighting, however desperately, however broken, ignited a flickering ember of hope, a confirmation that their cause was not entirely quixotic. The Imperium had endured, even if in a form beyond their wildest nightmares. "Set a course for Xylos Prime," Thorn commanded, his voice raw but resolute. "Magos, salvage what you can from this wreck. Information. navigational data, anything that can aid our journey. As they prepared to leave the haunted navigator ship, a final, horrifying vision flashed through Thorn's mind, a direct psychic echo from one of the corrupted navigators fused to the console. It was an image of a vast, armored figure, not of the Emperor, but of a monstrous space marine, its armor black as pitch, its eyes glowing with malevolent green fire, surrounded by a legion of diamond-infused warriors. And it was laughing, a cold, echoing laugh that promised unending torment. The visions faded, leaving Thorn gasping for breath, clutching his chainsword. The return of Guilliman, the new Primaris Marines, the Dark Imperium. It was all a desperate gamble in a galaxy consumed by eternal war, a war that had twisted even the Emperor's chosen into something horrific. The universe they had awakened to was not just shattered. It was diseased, corrupted to its very core. The Stonehearts, ancient and unyielding, were now navigating a sea of unimaginable horrors, their path illuminated by the dim, flickering whispers of a past they barely understood, and a future they could only dread. The journey to Xylos Prime was a torturous odyssey. The proximity to the Great Rift, or Cicatrix Maledictum, as the spectral echoes from the navigator ship had whispered, rendered warp travel impossible. Instead, the Vorlagen Seventh was forced to undertake a perilous, real space transit, navigating treacherous nebula, asteroid fields, and the faint, unsettling gravitational eddies left by ancient cataclysms. The remaining scout cutters, their Geller fields pushed to their absolute limits, bore the brunt of the journey, their crews constantly battling against minor, warp incursions and the gnawing dread of the surrounding void. Weeks bled into months as they crawled across the interstellar expanse. Supplies dwindled, morale buoyed by the grim hope of Xylos Prime, frayed under the constant pressure of isolation and the endless, silent watch. Thorn spent countless hours on the bridge of the Praxis Omega, meticulously reviewing the fragmented astrogation data, correlating it with what little star charts they possessed, all while the colossal, unblinking eye of the Great Rift stared back at them from the far edge of the void. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, their long-range augers picked up a distinct, regular energy signature, not the dying flickers of a warp-battered vessel, but the steady, powerful hum of active, albeit ancient, machinery. Xylos Prime. From orbit, Xylos Prime was a testament to the Imperium's lost glory and its ultimate vulnerability. It was a true forge world, its surface almost entirely consumed by gargantuan manufactories, towering spire cities, and sprawling atmospheric processors. But it was a forge world in stasis. No lights glittered from its vast urban sprawls. No telltale plumes of industrial effluence marred its upper atmosphere. It was a silent, rusting titan, a monument to a past epoch, lost and forgotten. As they descended through the murky, smog-laden atmosphere, the scale of the dereliction became starkly apparent. Colossal forge spires, some kilometers high, leaned precariously, their upper sections melted and twisted as if by unimaginable heat. Vast factory complexes lay half buried under mountains of rust and collapsed ferrocrete. The air, though breathable, tasted of old metal and dead ozone. "No active life signs detected, Colonel," reported Lieutenant Varos, his voice, tight with apprehension. "But sensor arrays indicate dormant defense grids and automated manufactories still functioning at minimal capacity. The core data stacks are still active." "That's something," Thorne grunted. "Magos, Kalen, can you establish a link? Override the dormant protocols?" Kalen's optical sensors glowed with a feral intensity. "It will be challenging, Colonel. The firewalls are ancient. Pre-heresy, perhaps, but the machine god guides my hand." They found a suitable landing zone within a vast, deserted landing pad complex, its surface cracked and overgrown with resilient, metallic-looking flora. The Vorlagian 7th disembarked with extreme caution. The silence of Xylos Prime was profound, broken only by the mournful whine of the wind whistling through ruined structures and the occasional, unsettling clang of shifting metal from deep within the city. It was a haunted place, a ghost of the Omnissiah Zemite. Their first encounters were not with human defenders, but with the Forge world's automatons. Servitors, ancient and heavily armored, still patrolled their pre-programmed routes. These were not the crude, half-conscious servitors of the 41st millennium, but sophisticated, almost sentient machines, their optical sensors glowing with a baleful crimson light. They were still guarding, still defending. But against what? And for whom? Their programming had clearly gone rogue. These automatons, having guarded an empty world for millennia, reacted with overwhelming force to any intrusion. Their internal logic corrupted by endless, unfulfilled directives. The Vorlagian 7th found themselves in brutal skirmishes against hulking Castellan robots, their ancient flamers spitting fire, their fists crushing ferrocrete. Skitarii automatons, their cybernetic bodies eerily intact, moved with uncanny speed, their galvanic rifles crackling with deadly energy. "These are not standard servitors, Colonel!" Kyle bellowed, his chainsword deflecting a Castellan's crushing blow, the sound a horrifying shriek of metal on metal. "They fight with strategic intent, like they're still at war." Thorn himself, leading a squad against a phalanx of silent, implacable Skitarii, felt a chill. These automatons were not defending against a physical threat, but against an unseen, eternal enemy following ghost orders from a long-dead master. The war they were still fighting was a phantom, born of corrupted logic and endless isolation. After days of brutal, attritional fighting, costing them more precious ammunition and lives, Magos Kalen finally achieved a breakthrough. Deep within the central spire, the core data reliquary, he managed to bypass the final ancient firewalls, linking the Praxis Omega to Xylos Prime's central cogitator network. A torrent of data flooded their systems, not just technical schematics and manufacturing protocols, but historical records, logs from thousands of years ago, detailing the Forge world's final days. Xylos Prime had been a bastion of the Mechanicum, a loyalist world, during a cataclysmic conflict referred to as the Schism of Souls, a massive internal Mechanicus civil war that erupted during the very early days of the Great Rift's formation, fueled by technological heresy and warp-tainted archaeotech. The Forge world had been engaged in a desperate, protracted siege, fighting against corrupted Mechanicus factions who had embraced forbidden knowledge and allied themselves with warp entities. The final log entry described a devastating warp incursion. The last remaining loyalist, Magos, initiating a desperate stasis protocol, freezing the Forge world in a state of suspended animation, hoping for imperial relief that never came. The revelation hit Thorn with profound implications. The very machines they were fighting were loyalists, albeit maddened by isolation and corrupted programming. It was a tragic irony, another cruel twist in the tale of their lost Imperium. But among the tragic logs, there was also an unimaginable boon. The stasis protocol had not only frozen the Forge world, but it had also preserved its manufacturing capabilities and its vast armories. Magos Kalen's servitors identified immense sealed vaults containing thousands of dormant combat servitors, pristine Skitarii legions, and, most crucially for the Stonehearts, stockpiles of perfectly preserved heavy carapace armor, lace gun power packs, bolter ammunition, fuel, and even fully operational Lehman Russ tanks, all of ancient yet powerful design. It was an impossible treasure, a literal army unearthed from the grave of time. Thorn stood before the holographic projection of the Forge world's schematics, his eyes gleaming with a fierce, renewed hope. This was it. This was their chance. not merely to rebuild their numbers, but to truly rearm, to equip a force capable of making a dent in this grim new galaxy. The tragic history of Xylos Prime, a loyalist world lost to a terrible civil war, now offered the means for the Stonehearts to wage their own. "Magos Kalen," Thorn said, his voice ringing with authority. "Initiate awakening protocols. Prioritize full diagnostics and purification. We will take this world. We will rearm, and we will make ready. The Imperium may have fallen once, but by the Emperor, its armories will now serve a new purpose. We are no longer just a single regiment. We are a nascent legion." The grim discovery on Xylos Prime, the haunting whispers of a forgotten Mechanicus civil war, and the tragic irony of fighting a loyalist world's automated defenders had revealed yet another layer of the galaxy's pervasive suffering. But it had also delivered an unparalleled opportunity, a glimmer of true hope, purchased at the cost of blood and understanding. The Stonehearts had found their forge, and with it, the means to truly begin their impossible crusade. Xylos Prime, once a silent monument to a tragic past, thrummed back to life under the relentless will of Colonel Thorn and the technical genius of Magos Kalen. The process of awakening the dormant forge world was a titanic undertaking, a dance between archaic protocols and desperate improvisation. Kalen's tech priests, augmented by the few remaining Vorlagian engineers, worked ceaselessly, purging corrupted logic ghosts from ancient cogitators, coaxing long-dormant reactors back to life, and meticulously recalibrating forgotten manufactories. The first clang of newly forged metal, the first hiss of steam from reactivated processing plants, was a symphony of defiance against the millennia of silence. The greatest challenge and greatest boon was the integration of Xylos Prime's automated defenders. The Castellan robots and Skitarii automatons, their ancient programming purged of the maddened enemy combatant directives, were brought under Vorlagian control. These were not the crude, mass-produced Skitarii of the 41st millennium, but intricate, highly advanced warriors, their cybernetic bodies a fusion of man and machine, designed for precision warfare. They joined the Vorlagian 7th, silent, implacable legions of steel and arcane knowledge, swelling the ranks of the Stonehearts from a battered regiment to a nascent army. With the resources of a fully functional, if ancient, forge world at their disposal, the Vorlagian 7th began to truly rearm. Their heavy carapace armor, already robust, was reinforced with layers of ceramite and plasteel produced by Xylos Prime's manufactories, its design subtly updated with scavenged schematics while retaining its distinctive brutalist aesthetic. Their laser guns, while still fundamentally the same design, were upgraded with more efficient power packs and enhanced optics. Most significantly, the Forge World's immense armories yielded dozens of Leman Russ battle tanks, their adamantium hulls gleaming, their mighty battle cannons ready to roar. Squads of heavy, stubber-armed guardsmen were replaced with dedicated heavy weapons teams fielding multi-lasers and missile launchers, all refurbished and blessed by Magos Kalen. Their new Vorlegian recruits from Alpha 7 Rho were ferried to Xylos Prime, undergoing a brutal, accelerated training regimen. They were taught to operate the reactivated Skitarii automatons, to maintain the Leman Russ tanks, and to serve as support crews for the expanded heavy weapon emplacements. Clad in new, albeit still archaic, Imperial Guard fatigues, and armed with newly forged laser guns, they became the second wave of the new Imperium. But their newfound strength soon attracted unwanted attention. Xylos Prime's sudden reawakening, its industrial output surging, sent faint energy, ripples across the turbulent void near the Great Rift. And the galaxy, in its grim, starved state, was quick to react to such a beacon. The first to arrive were the scavengers, petty rogue traders, and void pirates, their vessels a motley collection of battered transports and cobbled-together gunships. They were easily dispatched by the reactivated orbital defense platforms and the newly operational squadrons of Xylos Prime's ancient interceptors, piloted by daring Vorlegian guardsmen and guided by Magos Kalen's servitors. These small victories were crucial, allowing the Stonehearts to test their new equipment and integrate their expanded forces. Then came the true threat. A vast, sprawling armada, its ships bristling with crude weaponry, and its hulls covered in a patchwork of rust and spiked armor plating, emerged from the turbulent shadows near the Great Rift. Its astropathic choir, when Magos Kalen finally managed to intercept its cacophony, was a discordant symphony of guttural roars and frenzied warlike chants. It was a war band of the orcs, a true wogue drawn by the irresistible scent of a fight and the promise of new, shiny toys. Colonel Thorne stood on the orbital command bridge of the Praxis Omega, which had been relegated to a strategic oversight and long-range intelligence role above Xylos Prime. He watched the green horde approach, a tide of scrap metal and brute force. "So, the greenskins have found us," he rumbled, a grim satisfaction in his voice. "Good. We have been preparing." This was their first true test as a revitalized force. This was the long war, the endless struggle against the Xenos that defined the 41st millennium. The orcs, ever present, ever hungry, were a brutal reminder of the galaxy's pervasive threats. The orbital battle was fierce. Xylos Prime's automated defense grid, resurrected from millennia of dormancy, proved surprisingly effective. Lance batteries, once silent, ripped through Orc assault ships, their energy bursts puncturing hulls. Macro cannons, thundering with earth-shattering force, tore smaller craft apart. The reactivated interceptor squadrons, though numerically inferior, performed daring attack runs, their plasma cannons scorching Orc vessels. But the Orcs were legion, and their crude vessels were built to absorb punishment. Wave after wave slammed into the orbital defenses, their sheer numbers threatening to overwhelm the Forge world. Landing craft, crude and reinforced, began to penetrate the atmosphere, hurtling towards the surface like meteorites. "They're deploying ground forces," Lieutenant Varos shouted, his hands flying across the tactical displays. "Massive numbers. Estimated initial planetary drop in Sector Gamma 7. Thorn didn't hesitate. This was what they had prepared for. Full planetary defense protocols, scrambling all air assets. Magos, bring Xylos Prime's surface defense grid to full power. Kael, get your men to the Gamma 7 lines. Unleash the Skitarii legions. On the surface of Xylos Prime, the revitalized Stonehearts met the Orc invasion with disciplined fury. Squadrons of Lehman Russ tanks, painted in the traditional drab greens and grays of the Vorlesian 7th, rolled across the barren plains, their battle cannons roaring, spitting death into the onrushing tide of green. Behind them, lines of guardsmen, their lasguns forming a disciplined wall of fire, mowed down waves of Orc boys. The Skitarii legions, silent and implacable, marched in precise formations, their galvanic rifles spitting arcs of lightning, their heavy weapons teams laying down devastating volleys of plasma and focused laser fire. They moved with an alien grace, their enhanced senses detecting the Orcs even through the thick, industrial haze. It was a clash of two very different eras. The ancient, relentless discipline of the Stonehearts, now augmented by advanced Mechanicus technology, against the raw, chaotic, and seemingly endless might of the Orc Wah. The battle for Xylos Prime was not a swift victory, but a grinding, brutal attrition. The Orcs, driven by their innate desire for violence, threw themselves at the Imperial lines with maniacal glee. Casualties mounted on both sides. Vorlagian guardsmen fought hand to hand with hulking knobs, their chainswords revving against crude choppas. Lehman Russ tanks were swarmed by hundreds of Orcs, their crews fighting desperately from within their armored cocoons. But the Stonehearts held. Their new equipment, their expanded forces, and their unyielding Vorlagian will allowed them to match the Orc onslaught. They pushed back, slowly but surely, reclaiming sector after sector of the vast Forge world, their discipline and superior firepower eventually breaking the back of the Orc advance. After weeks of continuous, savage fighting, the last of the Orc warbands were scattered, their ships either destroyed or fleeing back into the turbulent void, their broken. Xylos Prime, though battered and scarred by the conflict, remained in Imperial hands. The victory was glorious, a testament to their renewed strength. But it was not without its cost. Thousands of newly trained New Vorlagian recruits lay dead. Dozens of precious Lehman Russ tanks were damaged, their repairs consuming vast resources. The Forge world itself was ravaged, its industrial output temporarily crippled by the fighting. Colonel Thorne, standing amidst the ruined manufactories, overseeing the grim task of body recovery, felt a familiar ache of weariness. They had won. They had proven their worth. But this was only the beginning. The long war, the endless grind against the galaxy's myriad horrors, stretched out before them, an infinite horizon of blood and sacrifice. Xylos Prime was secure for now. Their legion was forged. But the galaxy of the 41st millennium was a beast of unending hunger, and they had just announced their presence. The fight, Thorne knew, would never truly end. The Long War, as Colonel Thorne grimly dubbed it, raged on, an unending tide of Xenos aggression and internal strife. Xylos Prime, their revitalized Forge world, became a hub of desperate industry, churning out new weapons, armor, and servitors to replenish the Stoneheart's ever-dwindling ranks. But even with the might of a Forge world, resources were finite, and the true cost of their crusade was being paid, not just in materiel, but in the souls of the men and women who comprised the Vorlagian Seventh. This burden, heavier than any carapace armor, fell most heavily upon the shoulders of Commissar Anya Kreska. Kreska was a creature forged in the crucible of Vorlog's harsh discipline, her faith in the Emperor absolute, her methods unyielding. She was the embodiment of imperial justice, brutal and uncompromising, a necessary instrument in the grim work of rebuilding. Yet, even her iron resolve was beginning to chafe under the immense, unending pressure of their impossible task. Initially, her role had been clear: maintain morale, enforce discipline, punish heresy, and ensure unwavering loyalty to the Emperor and Colonel Thorne. She had executed her duties with brutal efficiency, purging the Genestealer cultists, instilling fear and respect in the new recruits, and executing summary judgments without hesitation. But the sheer scale of the galaxy's madness, the unending parade of horrors, and the constant, agonizing compromises they were forced to make gnawed at her. The new Vorlagians, the uplifted primitives, now formed the bulk of their fighting force. They were loyal, certainly, but their understanding of the Imperium was still rudimentary, their faith often a transactional one, safety for service. To truly integrate them, Kreska found herself bending, subtly at first, the rigid doctrines of the Imperium she had once held sacred. She allowed for certain local customs to persist, so long as they did not overtly contradict imperial dogma. She permitted a simplified, more visceral interpretation of the imperial creed, understanding that the complex theological nuances of the ecclesiarchy were beyond the comprehension of these newly enlightened souls. This gradual deviation, however necessary for their survival, weighed heavily on her. Every concession, every pragmatic compromise felt like a small betrayal of the true Imperium, the one she remembered, the one they were sworn to rebuild. She would spend long hours in the solitude of her quarters, meticulously cleaning her bolt pistol, debating with the spectral voices of her ancestors, justifying her actions to an emperor whose gaze felt impossibly distant. Was she upholding his will, or corrupting it in her desperation? Her true burden manifested in the relentless training and indoctrination. She pushed the new recruits harder than ever, forcing them through brutal combat drills, psychic conditioning against warp influence, and endless hours of catechism and prayer. She saw the fear in their eyes, the exhaustion in their movements, the wavering in their spirits. And she knew that to allow them weakness was to condemn them to a fate worse than death, to falling prey to the countless horrors that prowled the void. Her compassion, a hidden, almost forgotten facet of her character, was a luxury she simply could not afford. She had to break them down to build them stronger, even if it meant extinguishing some part of their humanity. One particularly harsh incident cemented her internal struggle. During a training exercise for a newly formed company of Skitarii augmented New Vorlagian Guard, a minor warp manifestation erupted. A tiny, fleeting tear in reality caused by residual warp taint on Xylos Prime. Panic spread quickly among the raw recruits. A young new Vorlagian, barely out of adolescence, froze, his weapon clattering to the ground, his eyes wide with terror as he screamed for his primitive star brother. Without hesitation, Kreska raised her bolt pistol. Thorn, observing the exercise, started forward, but she fired before he could intervene. The recruit's head exploded in a spray of gore, his body crumpling to the ground. The sudden, brutal act silenced the panic, freezing the remaining recruits in their tracks, their fear of the commissar momentarily eclipsing their fear of the warp. Later, in Thorn's office, the air crackled with unspoken tension. "That was harsh, Anya," Thorn said, his voice quiet, betraying no accusation, only observation. He was just a boy, terrified. Kreska turned, her face a stark mask of grim duty. He was a weak link, Colonel, a potential infection. One moment of panic can unravel an entire line, especially against warp creatures. We cannot afford such luxury. Not here. Not now. Her voice was flat, but Thorn saw the tremor in her hands, the almost imperceptible clench of her jaw. "It will break you, Anya," Thorn observed, not as a judgment, but as a warning. This path, the constant executions, the compromises, the endless brutality, even your faith has limits. "My faith is in the Emperor's divine will, Colonel," she retorted, her voice regaining its usual steel. "And his will, as I interpret it, is the survival of humanity at any cost. If that means I become a monster in the eyes of others, then so be it. If it means I sacrifice my own soul for the greater good of this nascent imperium, then I will do so gladly." She paused, her gaze locking with his. "We are all becoming something darker, Kaelin. This galaxy demands it. Don't pretend you are immune." Thorn looked away, unable to deny her words. He saw the truth in her eyes. Kreska was not a monster. She was a woman drowning under the weight of an impossible duty, making choices that tore at her soul, all for the sake of an ideal that, with every passing day, seemed more distant and unattainable. She was the anchor of their faith, the enforcer of their discipline, and the living embodiment of the grim compromises required to survive. As the months turned into years, and the Stonehearts engaged in skirmishes and small-scale crusades against Xenos incursions, rogue cults, and even petty human warlords, Kreska's burden grew. She witnessed the erosion of her own humanity, the hardening of her heart into something cold and unforgiving. Each bolt round fired in the name of purity, each life taken for discipline, chipped away at the woman beneath the uniform. But she endured. She stood firm. She became a legend among the new Vorlosian Guard, a terrifying, revered figure known as the Iron Commissar, whose gaze alone could instill discipline, whose judgment was absolute. They feared her, yes, But they also respected her, for they saw that her harshness was born not of cruelty, but of an unwavering commitment to their survival. Anya Kreska, the grim enforcer of a forgotten imperium, was a hero in her own right, her unwavering faith a beacon in the darkness. But her heroism was a tragic one, paid for with the slow, agonizing sacrifice of her own soul, constantly struggling with the question of how much deviation from doctrine was permissible for survival, and whether the Imperium they were rebuilding was truly worthy of such a terrible cost. The fragile ember of the Stoneheart's new Imperium flickered precariously, a tiny flame in the vast, malevolent darkness of the 41st millennium. Xylos Prime, their forge world, had become a bastion, churning out materiel and recruits, but their reach remained limited to a handful of systems. Colonel Thorn, haunted by the whispers of the Dark Imperium from the dying navigator ship, knew their isolated domain was dangerously vulnerable. The galaxy was a hungry beast, and they were but a morsel. His fears materialized with brutal efficacy. Scans from the Praxis Omega, now a dedicated orbital command and reconnaissance platform, detected a massive inbound fleet signature. It was unlike anything they had encountered before, not the chaotic wah of the orcs, nor the stealthy infiltration of the Jaina Stealers. This was a coherent, organized force, its vessels bearing the ancient, blasphemous iconography of chaos. Thousands of ships, vast and menacing, emerging from the turbulent edges of the Great Rift, drawn by the burgeoning energy signature of Xylos Prime. This was no mere raiding party. This was a consolidated chaos warband, a full-scale invasion. "The augurs scream, Colonel," Magos Kalen reported, his modulated voice devoid of its usual clinical detachment, replaced by a tremor of genuine dread. "The fleet bears the mark of the blood-tide reavers, a Zentian-aligned warband. Their forces are legion, and their flagship, it is a desecrated imperial battle barge. A monster." Thorn gripped the hilt of his chainsword, his knuckles white. Tzinch, the changer of ways, the lord of lies. This was a foe that preyed not just on flesh, but on logic, on faith, on the very fabric of reality. Their battle would be one of not just steel and fire, but of will and spirit. "Status on planetary defenses?" Thorn barked, his voice betraying no fear, only a grim resolve. "Orbital platforms are at maximum readiness," Lieutenant Varos responded, his hands flying across the tactical displays, sweat beading on his brow. "Surface-to-orbit batteries are primed. All void shield generators are online, but they will be overwhelmed quickly, sir. Their numbers are too great. Colonel Thorne knew it. He looked at the faces of his officers, the exhaustion, the fear, the unwavering loyalty. He looked at the nascent legion they had built from ash and iron, the remaining Vorlagen veterans, the Skitarii automatons, the massed ranks of new Vorlagian guard. Their numbers were respectable, their equipment advanced for their time, but they were still a tiny island against an ocean of depravity. Then we will make them pay for every inch, Thorne declared, his voice a low, gravelly growl that promised death. Prepare for the siege of Xylos Prime. All forces to battle stations. This is our stand. This is where we prove what the Imperium truly means. The Chaos Fleet descended like a plague, their corrupted vessels twisted into nightmare shapes of bronze and black, raining down ordnance upon Xylos Prime. Orbital defense platforms spat lance beams and macro cannon shells, tearing gaps in the enemy fleet. But for every ship destroyed, 3 more surged forward. Void shields shimmered and buckled under the sustained bombardment. Soon, the first Chaos landing pods, grotesque drop ships fashioned from flesh and corrupted metal, began to pierce the atmosphere, bypassing the battered orbital defenses. They struck the surface of Xylos Prime like meteors, disgorging legions of cultists, mutants, and hulking Chaos Space Marines, their power armor defiled with blasphemous symbols, and their weapons crackling with unholy energies. The battlefield became a maelstrom of fire and fury. The Stonehearts, arrayed in meticulously prepared defensive lines, met the onslaught with disciplined volleys of Lasfire and the thunder of Leman Russ battle cannons. The Skitarii legions, silent and implacable, marched into the fray, their galvanic rifles scything down cultists, their heavy weapons tearing apart mutated beasts. Colonel Thorne led from the front, his chainsword roaring, its teeth tearing through the corrupted flesh and armor of cultists and renegades. He fought with a grim ferocity, his every swing a prayer, his every parry a testament to his unbreakable will. Beside him, Sergeant Kael Kael was a whirlwind of heavy stubber, fire, and chainsword sweeps, his armor already scored with scorch marks and blasphemous runes. But the forces of chaos were a tide of unending horror. Mutants surged forward, their bodies twisted into grotesque parodies of humanity. Sorcerers of Tzench chanted arcane rites, tearing holes in reality, summoning screaming demons from the warp. Traitor Astartes, once proud space marines, now hulking giants of blasphemous power, carved bloody paths through the Imperial lines, their bolters spitting ceramite-shredding shells. The psychological warfare was as devastating as the physical. Zendchayan whispers, insidious and maddening, wormed their way into the minds of the new Vorlagian guard, sowing doubt, tempting them with promises of power, attempting to unravel their fragile faith. Demons of Tzench, their forms shifting and twisting, flickered in and out of existence, their impossible anatomies challenging the very sanity of the defenders. Commissar Kreska, her face a mask of iron, moved relentlessly through the front lines. Her bolt pistol cracked, dispatching not just routed cultists, but also any guardsman showing signs of faltering faith or succumbing to the warp's whispers. She delivered savage, inspiring speeches, her voice a steel lash of defiance against the insidious temptations of chaos. Hold the line, for the Emperor, damnation to the faithless, purity through fire. Day and night, the siege continued, a relentless, grinding horror. The void shields around Xylos Prime flickered and died, unable to withstand the constant orbital bombardment. Manufactories were leveled, hab blocks consumed by warp fire. Casualties mounted at an unsustainable rate. The disciplined lines of the Stonehearts were bent, but not yet broken. Thorn knew they could not hold forever. Their numbers were dwindling. Ammunition was running dangerously low. The Forge world, their only source of replenishment, was being systematically destroyed around them. Their final stand would have to be at the core data reliquary, the heart of Xylos Prime, a last, desperate redoubt of ancient Mechanicus technology, and the Litra, last hope for their nascent Imperium. As the suns of Xylos Prime set, casting long, bloody shadows across the ruined landscape, the Chaos forces launched their final, overwhelming assault. A monstrous demon, Prince, its form a grotesque fusion of man and avian horror, shrieked a challenge from atop a mound of corpses, its voice tearing at the very fabric of reality. Behind it, thousands of cultists, demon-kin, and traitor marines surged forward, a tide of unholy fury, intent on overwhelming the last defenders. Colonel Thorn looked at his remaining officers, their faces grim but resolute. Sergeant Kyle Kale, battered and bloodied, stood ready. Magos, Kalen, his servitors armed with arcane weapons, prepared for a final, desperate defense of his sacred data. Commissar Kreska, her eyes burning with an almost fanatical light, gripped her bolt pistol, ready to purge the last vestiges of doubt and despair from her men. "This is it, guardsmen," Thorn voxed to his dwindling forces, his voice rasping but clear. "The darkest hour, the final stand. For 10,000 years, we have served. For 10,000 more we shall fight. For the Emperor, for the Imperium. A ragged cheer, defiant and desperate, rose from the beleaguered ranks. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and facing insurmountable odds. But they were the stone hearts of Vorlog, and they would make their stand. Their most desperate battle against the overwhelming might of chaos had begun. The fate of their impossible dream, of the new Imperium, hung by a single fraying thread. The final assault on Xylos Prime's core. Data Reliquary was a descent into an unholy maelstrom. The Demon Prince, a grotesque fusion of avian malice and arcane might, shrieked its challenge, its voice ripping through the air like tearing metal. Behind it, a seemingly endless tide of Tzeentchian cultists, gibbering mutants, and corrupted Chaos Space Marines surged, their advance illuminated by the infernal glow of warp fire and the crackle of arcane energies. The very ground trembled under their blasphemous tread. Colonel Thorn, a figure of iron defiance amidst the chaos, stood at the reliquary's main entrance, his heavy carapace armor scored and dented, his chainsword revving a furious growl. Around him, the last bastion of the Stone Hearts grimly prepared for death. Sergeant Kyle, a hulking monument of defiance, manned a heavy stubber, its barrel already glowing red-hot from continuous fire. Magos Kalen and his servitors, their optical sensors burning with unholy light, had repurposed the reliquary's data conduits into improvised energy weapons, spitting arcs of raw power into the onrushing horde. And Commissar Anya Kreska, a grim angel of death, moved through the ranks, her bolt pistol dispatching any who faltered, her voice a steel lash of faith against the gnawing whispers of Tzeentch. The Demon Prince, propelled by unnatural flapping wings, tore through the outer defenses, its talons rending ferrocrete and flesh with equal ease. Its very presence warped reality, twisting the minds of those who dared gaze upon it. Its skin shimmered with impossible colors. Its beak-like maw cackled with insane glee. This was the embodiment of the Great Rift's horrors, a creature from the very heart of the warp. "For the Emperor, hold the line," Thorn bellowed, his voice raw, as he confronted a towering Chaos Space Marine, its power armor defiled with Tzeentchian symbols. His chainsword crashed against the traitor's blasphemous blade, sparks showering the air. He fought with a desperate fury, knowing that if this line broke, all was lost. But the Demon Prince was their true nemesis. It targeted the main entrance, its psychic might battering against the reliquary's reinforced doors. Magos, Kalen, and his servitors unleashed a torrent of energy, focused laser blasts tearing at the creature's warp-infused hide. But the demon prince merely cackled, its form shifting, deflecting the assaults. It was too powerful, too resilient. Casualties mounted with terrifying speed. New Vorlagian guardsmen, though bravely fought, were torn apart by mutants or disintegrated by sorcerous blasts. Skitarii automatons, designed for precision, were swarmed and overwhelmed by sheer numbers, their internal logic systems overloaded by the warp's influence. Even the veteran Stonehearts were falling one by one, their courage unable to stem the impossible tide. A massive psychic blast from the demon prince slammed into the reliquary's entrance, sending guardsmen flying. The reinforced doors buckled inwards, groaning under the strain. Thorn knew they had moments before the breach. "Colonel!" Magos Kalen's Vox cried, his voice strained with urgency. "The core. It is connected directly to the Forge World's primary reactor. A full overload. It could destroy this entire sector, vaporize the demon prince, but it would consume the reliquary, and potentially Xylos Prime itself. The choice was impossible. Sacrifice their last bastion, their only means of production, to halt the invasion, or allow the demon prince to breach, to corrupt the sacred data, to spread its taint throughout the systems they had so painstakingly liberated. It was no choice at all. "Do it, Magos!" Thorn roared, his eyes fixed on the demon prince, its impossible form now visible through the splintering doors. "Overload the reactor. Purify this place with fire." But the Magos hesitated. "The time delay, Colonel. It will take minutes to initiate the cascade. The demon prince will breach before then. It will escape." In that moment of desperate realization, Commissar Anya Kreska made her choice. Her face, grim and resolute, hardened with an almost sacred purpose. She looked at Thorn, a silent understanding passing between them. Then, without a word, she turned to the remaining companies of New Vorlagian Guard. Her voice, amplified by her Vox-hailer, cutting through the din of battle like a clarion call. "For the Emperor!" she shrieked, her voice infused with a fanatical zeal, a purity of faith that banished all doubt. "To me, sons and daughters of New Vorlag, we will hold this line. We will buy the time." She charged, not at the demon prince, but directly into the heart of the onrushing chaos horde, her bolt pistol spitting death, her chainsword a blur of motion. Her personal guard, the commissar cadre of veteran Stonehearts, formed a shield around her, their faces grim, their resolve unshakable. The new Vorlagen guard, witnessing her suicidal charge, found new, desperate courage. They roared, a primal, defiant sound, and followed her, throwing themselves into the teeth of the Chaos legions, a living wave of flesh and blood, sacrificing themselves to delay the inevitable. Colonel Thorne watched, his heart clenching with a profound sorrow and admiration. Anya, always the rock, always the first to stand, the last to fall. He knew what she was doing. She was giving them the minutes Kaelin needed. She was offering herself and the remaining New Vorlegians as the ultimate sacrifice. "Sergeant Kael," Thorne shouted, his voice cracking with emotion. "Defend the Magos. No one touches that console." Thorne then turned, his chainsword revving, and plunged back into the fray, fighting with a ferocity born of grief and desperation, buying precious seconds, drawing the attention of the Chaos Space Marines away from the detonating reactor core. He saw the Demon Prince, its massive form now halfway through the shattered doors, its eyes fixing on him, recognizing the challenge. The battle raged. A blur of screams, explosions, and the clang of steel. Kreska's last stand was a maelstrom of courage and death. She was a beacon of defiance, her bolt pistol flashing, her chainsword tearing through cultist after cultist, until finally, overwhelmed by a swarm of mutants and a massive, crushing blow from a chaos spawn, she fell. Her last act was to raise an Aquila-emblazoned gauntlet to the sky, a final, silent prayer to the Emperor. And then, the reliquary began to hum, a deep, resonant thrumming that shook the very foundations of Xylos Prime. Magos Kaelin, his faceplate glowing, watched his primary diagnostics. "Initiation sequence complete, Colonel. Reactor breaching critical. 2 minutes to detonation." The Demon Prince sensed it. Its cackles died, replaced by a guttural roar of alarm. It turned, attempting to flee, to escape the impending doom. But Thorne and Kael, along with the few remaining Stonehearts, threw themselves at it, slowing its retreat, buying the final, agonizing seconds. The hum intensified, growing into a deafening roar. Blue-white light began to bleed from the cracks in the reliquary walls, growing in intensity. Chaos cultists shrieked in terror, attempting to flee, but there was nowhere to go. The very air began to liquefy, distorting their forms. "For Anya!" Thorne roared, launching himself at the Demon Prince. One last time, his chainsword biting deep into its leg, slowing it, just for an instant. Then, with an earth-shattering detonation, the core reactor of Xylos Prime's reliquary went critical. A blinding nova of energy, a cascade of pure, incandescent fury erupted from the heart of the Forge world. It consumed everything: the demon prince, the remaining chaos forces, the shattered reliquary, and the last defiant defenders. The very ground liquefied, turning into a searing inferno. From the safety of orbit, the Praxis Omega crew watched in stunned silence as a section of Xylos Prime, miles wide, vanished in a searing flash, replaced by a mushroom cloud of incandescent plasma and superheated dust that clawed at the sky. A grim, terrible beauty. Silence descended once more, but this time it was a silence born of utter devastation. The demon prince was gone. The Chaos Warband was broken, its leadership annihilated, its ground forces consumed. Xylos Prime was saved, but at an unimaginable price. Colonel Thorn, Sergeant Kale Kale, Commissar Kreska, and countless others were gone, purified in the Emperor's fire. The sacrifice was absolute. The Stonehearts had delivered Xylos Prime from damnation, but they had paid for it with their very heart and soul. Their greatest victory had been achieved, but at the cost of their most profound loss. The silence that followed the cataclysmic detonation on Xylos Prime was heavier than any void. A profound emptiness that echoed the immense sacrifice made. From the Praxis Omega, orbiting high above, the survivors watched as the superheated plume of plasma slowly dissipated, revealing a raw, smoking crater where once the core data reliquary, and with it Colonel Thorn, Commissar Kreska, Sergeant Kael Kael, and countless brave Stonehearts had stood. The sector of the Forge world was a wasteland of melted slag and incandescent ash, utterly purified, utterly annihilated. Lieutenant Veros, now the highest-ranking officer of the Vorlagian 7th, felt a profound emptiness in his gut. The names of the fallen were etched into his soul. His colonel, his commissar, his sergeant, the very pillars of their impossible crusade. Gone. The command bridge of the Praxis Omega was a place of ghosts, each empty console a reminder of a life lost. Magos Kylan, his optical sensors dimmed, his metallic frame shuddering with what might have been grief or circuits overloading, was the first to break the silence. The Daemon Prince, its psychic signature has vanished. The warp taint across Xylos Prime is receding. The ritual purification was successful. His voice, usually modulated and precise, held a note of profound weariness. But the cost, the Forge world's central processing nexus, destroyed. Its primary reactor utterly consumed. Varos understood the implications. Xylos Prime was saved from corruption, but crippled as a true Forge world. Its vast manufactories were still operational, powered by auxiliary reactors, but without the central nexus, its efficiency would be drastically reduced. Its ability to churn out advanced technology severely hampered. They had lost their heart, both militarily and industrially. The grim task of assessing the aftermath began. Shuttles, piloted by weary but resolute new Vorlagian guard, descended to the scarred surface. What they found was a landscape of devastation. Thousands of chaos cultists and mutants had been obliterated in the blast. The remnants of the Chaos Warband, leaderless and broken, were scattered and in disarray, fleeing back into the void, or being hunted down by the surviving Skitarii legions. The immediate threat was gone. But the price was paid in blood and irreplaceable lives. Only a fraction of the original Vorlagian Seventh remained. Perhaps 100 veterans, battle-scarred and weary, their faces etched with grief. The new Vorlagian Guard, though they had fought with incredible courage in the final moments, had been decimated, their numbers cut in half. The Skitarii legions, while largely intact due to their cybernetic resilience, were now without their central command structure, relying on emergency protocols and the fragmented orders of Magos Kalen. Lieutenant Varos, thrust into command, felt the crushing weight of responsibility. He was a pilot, not a tactician. He had flown the cutters, not commanded armies. Yet he was all they had left. He looked at the faces of the remaining Stonehearts, grizzled veterans, stoic and grim, but clearly shaken by the losses. Their unwavering faith remained, but it was now shadowed by a profound, collective sorrow. "We begin again," Varos declared, his voice trembling slightly, but firming with each word, echoing the unbreakable spirit of his fallen colonel. "We honor their sacrifice. We salvage what we can. We rebuild for the Emperor, for them." The task was monumental. The orbital defenses, though damaged, were still operational, warding off opportunistic scavengers. The remaining manufactories on Xylos Prime, albeit slower and less efficient, began to churn out basic supplies, repairing the damaged equipment, and slowly, painstakingly, manufacturing new lace guns and carapace plates. The few remaining Lehman Russ tanks, scarred but still functional, were brought in for overhaul. Varro, guided by the tactical wisdom he had absorbed from Thorn, established a new command structure, promoting the most capable veterans and new Vorlagian officers. He relied heavily on Magos Kalin for technical advice and the Skitarii legions for muscle, and on the few remaining commissars for morale and discipline. It was a makeshift command, but it held. The surviving new Vorlagian Guard, having witnessed the ultimate sacrifice of Commissar Kreska and Colonel Thorn, found their fragile faith hardened into something unbreakable. Kreska's last stand became a legend, a grim catechism of absolute devotion. They carved crude totems in her honor, incorporating the aquila and a stylized bolt pistol into their newfound iconography. The Emperor, once a distant ideal, now felt closer, represented by the terrible, glorious sacrifice of their leaders. They mourned, but they also learned. The cost of freedom was eternal vigilance and boundless sacrifice. The new Imperium was now a raw, bleeding wound. Its heart, the spiritual and command nucleus of the Vorlagian Seventh, was gone. Its primary engine of production, Xylos Prime, was crippled. Its ranks were decimated. Their vision of rebuilding a glorious empire from the ashes now seemed more impossible than ever. A cruel joke played by the merciless galaxy. Yet they endured. The solemn burials of the fallen, where only scorched earth remained, were marked by prayers and oaths of vengeance. Varos stood before his remaining men, his uniform stained with dust and grief, but his eyes blazing with a cold fire. They gave their lives so we could continue, he proclaimed, his voice echoing across the silent, scarred landscape. We will not let that sacrifice be in vain. We will carry their banner. We will honor their memory. The stone hearts had survived, but they were irrevocably changed. They were a shadow of their former selves, a broken regiment clinging to a crippled forge world, surrounded by an indifferent, hostile galaxy. Their purpose, however, remained. The oath to rebuild the Imperium, forged in despair, now tempered by tragedy, continued to drive them forward. Their victories would forever be stained with a profound sorrow, and their future was cloaked in the darkest uncertainty. They had fought their darkest hour and emerged, not triumphant, but simply alive. A grim, enduring testament to the indomitable, if tragic, will of the Vorlagian Seventh. The scars on Xylos Prime never truly healed. The colossal crater, a grim monument to the sacrifice of Colonel Thorn and Commissar Kreska, remained a permanent testament to the cost of their survival. Lieutenant Varos, now acting commander, bore the weight of leadership with a quiet, steely resolve, his youthful features having aged beyond their years. The surviving Stonehearts, a grim, weary band of veterans, continued their impossible mission, their numbers a mere fraction of their original strength, their equipment salvaged and endlessly repaired, patched together with new, less efficient components from the crippled forge world. Their domain was a fragile ember, flickering precariously in the vast, malevolent night of the 41st millennium. Xylos Prime, their only true bastion, slowly recovered, its manufactories grinding out what they could. But the pre-heresy wonders were beyond their capacity to fully restore. New Vorlog, on Alpha 7 Rho, remained their agricultural heartland, supplying food and basic materials, its people now deeply indoctrinated and fiercely loyal to the Stonehearts, a name whispered with reverence and dread across the few worlds they touched. The new Imperium they forged was a distorted reflection of what once was. Its doctrines, born of their ancient, uncompromising faith, were now tempered by the brutal pragmatism demanded by their isolation and the galaxy's pervasive horrors. They were more insular, more suspicious, their vigilance against internal corruption absolute. Every new population they encountered, every primitive tribe they sought to uplift, was met with the commissariat's unblinking eye and the relentless scrutiny of Magos Kalin's servitors, searching for the slightest hint of Xenos taint or anarchic thought. Mercy remained a luxury they seldom afforded. Their influence spread slowly, painfully, across a handful of desolate systems on the fringe of the Great Rift. They became known as the Void Stones, a myth whispered among the scattered human remnants they encountered, a legion of ancient, armored warriors who emerged from the stars to reclaim lost worlds, bringing order with an iron fist and a righteous fire. To some, they were saviors, purging Xenos and cultists. To others, they were terrifying overlords, imposing a brutal, rigid order that brooked no dissent. But all respected their power, their discipline, and their unyielding will. Varos himself embodied this new, grim reality. He was a tactician and administrator, not the inspiring orator Thorn had been, nor the firebrand Kreska. But he possessed a quiet, enduring stubbornness, a resilience that had been forged in the crucible of loss. He carried the weight of their legacy, of their fallen leaders, and of the impossible task they had inherited. He knew they could not rebuild the Imperium as it once was. That was a fantasy. Instead, they would build an Imperium, a smaller, harder, more brutal reflection, but one that endured. Magos Kalen, now ancient even by tech priest standards, remained the mechanical heart of their fleet. His cybernetic form was a patchwork of repairs and jury-rigged components, but his devotion to the machine god and to the Stoneheart's cause was absolute. He constantly pushed the Praxis Omega's battered augurs to scan the turbulent void near the Great Rift, searching for any echo of the Dark Imperium, for any sign that the Emperor's realm still fought, however broken. He found little, only fleeting, corrupted whispers of greater wars, distant horrors, and the eternal, suffocating silence. The Stonehearts continued their long vigil, anachronisms in a galaxy that had moved on, their archaic equipment now less a relic and more a symbol of their enduring defiance. Their heavy carapace armor, repaired countless times, bore the scars of 1,000 battles, each scratch and dent a story of survival. Their laser guns, though still fundamentally the same, were now imbued with the spiritual weight of generations of service. Each shot a prayer. They would never again be the shining bastion of hope they had once envisioned. Hope for the Stonehearts was a flickering candle in an endless night. Every victory was hard won, every life costly, every step forward fraught with peril. They were not destined for triumph, perhaps not even for ultimate victory. Their destiny was simply to be, to endure, to fight, to stand as a living testament to a lost age, forever waging a war they could never truly win, against a galaxy that relentlessly sought their destruction. The Emperor, in their unwavering faith, watched over them. They believed this with every fiber of their being. And for as long as a single Stoneheart drew breath, for as long as their battered starships plied the void, for as long as their laser guns spat fire, the promise made by Colonel Thorne in the plaza of New Vorlog would stand. The Imperium was not gone, for it lived in them. They were its guardians, its rebuilders, its final, grim hope. And in the vast, uncaring darkness of the 41st millennium, that was enough. Lore complete.